Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to revisit a topic that I have kind of talked about before, but it's just very much on my mind right now. And that is the relationship that deities have to a particular place. So, for a little bit of context, I was in Italy last week. I was gone for about a week, and I was there primarily for a wedding. I have a roommate from grad school who is from Italy, and he and his wife were having their wedding ceremony in their hometown. So I flew out there. I was there for that. Had a really wonderful time. The wedding was beautiful. It was magnificent. But while I was there, took some time to be a tourist, and I spent a few days in Venice, which I had never been to. Had a wonderful time. Venice is just a magnificent city, and everything about it feels imaginary. Right? It feels like a setting for a fantasy novel. It's just what a town. But in particular, while I was there, I had a lot of thoughts that sort of simmered about the localized nature of deity. The Venetian Empire was a maritime empire that sort of rose up largely during the Renaissance, started sort of, late medieval and then into the Renaissance. And in Venetian art, you see the motifs of certain pagan gods. The Venetian Empire, decidedly Christian, no question about it. You see a lot of Christian motifs throughout Venetian art, but then mixed in with the Christian motifs, you also see a lot of pagan motifs that harken back to kind of the imagined glory of the Roman Empire. And in particular, there are two Roman deities who feature prominently in Venetian art, and they are Mars and Neptune. This is unsurprising because it was a maritime empire, right? They gained their glory through military conquest on the seas. So, of course, Mars and Neptune would be their guys. And you see a lot of art in Venice that prominently features Mars and Neptune alongside Christian figures like Christ, but then also alongside the personification of Venice herself, effectively the goddess of Venice. And it was really interesting being in Venice as a pagan because I really felt like there was a noticeable presence of those gods, in particular of Mars and Neptune. And those are gods with whom I don't have a relationship, right? I don't really worship any deities in the Roman pantheon. I'm not particularly drawn to worship any deities in the Roman pantheon. But being in Venice, being in that place where those gods were so important, you get a sense of presence. You get a sense of them being there and of it being appropriate to worship them. It really felt like Venice was a place where those gods belonged and where they made sense. And even though I am not in any way drawn to those deities, I felt an impulse to make offerings to Mars and Neptune while I was in Venice. And that's just got me thinking about the relationships that gods have with particular places. I've got a previous video on the channel, which I will link up above, and it's called The Gods of Right Here. And in that video, I talk a lot about the kind of ancient conception of gods at particular sanctuaries and how Aphrodite at Paphos was worshipped differently than Aphrodite at Byblos. And there was a sense of, sure, there may be some kind of, there is Aphrodite, but then there is our Aphrodite right here. And that might be different from the Aphrodite that you have somewhere else in the world. And I don't know that I have coherent thoughts, but I just have feelings. I have big feelings about the relationships between the gods and the land after coming back from a place where there was such a prominent presence of two deities who felt like they belonged in that place. And I do think there is really something to be said for an intimate connection between the land and gods. And that's something that modern pagans, and in particular American pagans, kind of lose access to, right? I do think there is something, I guess foreign is the word that I'm looking for, about lifting up a god wholesale and kind of removing it from the place where it was originally worshipped and then plopping it down in, whatever, San Francisco and saying, okay, we're gonna worship Neptune here. Like, yeah, you can, right? I don't think it's impossible, but I think there's something that gets lost. And conversely, I think there's also this idea of like there's something that feels maybe a little bit invasive about coming to a place where there are gods of that place, there are spirits of that place, and then worshiping other gods instead. Which gets messy in the United States because the indigenous spiritualities of this land are really not for a lot of people who don't belong to the tribes that partake in those spiritualities, right? So here in Salt Lake City, this is land that has historically been occupied by 5 tribes. There are 5 indigenous nations that have belonged to this land and continue to belong to this land. And they are the Ute, Paiute, Goshute, Diné Navajo, and who am I missing? There's one other. Shoshone. I don't want to be a white person in Salt Lake City trying to practice Paiute spirituality, right? Like, no part of that would be good for anyone involved. But there's a weird tension. There's a reckoning to be had as someone who is worshiping gods who kind of originate elsewhere, who belong elsewhere, and worshiping them in this place and in this context. And I don't think that they can't or shouldn't be worshipped here, right? I think I very much feel the presence of the Wiccan goddess when I look up into the Wasatch Mountains, but the goddess of the mountains here is different than the goddess of the New Forest in England. The first time that I went back to the UK after having been initiated into Wicca, I had this overwhelming feeling of, oh, Wicca makes sense here. Wicca fits here. Wicca belongs in this land in a way that it kind of has to change in order to make sense in other places. And to varying degrees, right? The climate of a place like New Jersey is going to be much closer to the climate of the UK than Utah is, let alone than, Southern California or Florida, or like the places where the seasons and the climate are just very drastically different from the UK, from the setting in which the gods of Wicca originally emerged. But, you still can, and people obviously still do, worship those gods in different places in the world. But I think there's this relationship that happens between gods and land that I have big feelings about it, and I'm struggling to put those feelings into words. I think part of it comes back to what we think a god is. And that's a question that I don't have the answer to. But the answer that I tend to give is that I think of a god as kind of a mystery embodied. I have a video about that as well, which I will try to link up above. But I think of a god as, right, like a face and a personality and a story that belong to a mystery, a transformative experience that lies behind all of that. And so there is a sense in which Aphrodite is not just a character from mythology. Aphrodite is love. Aphrodite is love itself. And that is true of all of the love deities in the world. But there's also a sense in which they're different, right? Aphrodite is love itself, but that doesn't make her identical to any other love goddess from around the world. And I think that the things that differentiate gods have to do with the time and the place and the people that they emerge with. So there is love, and love is the universal experience. Love is the mystery, the thing that is behind all of these gods. But then there is love as we experience it, as particular people in a particular place, in a particular time, belonging to a certain culture. And those are all things that kind of coalesce, and that the gods, for lack of a better phrase, shape themselves around. And that's what makes Aphrodite different from, I can't think of other love goddesses off the top of my head. So what makes Aphrodite different from Venus, right, is a difference in geography, a difference in culture, a difference in language and history. And none of those things individually is deterministic of a god. So you can worship a god in a different place than, the historical cult centers that belonged to that god. You can worship a god in a different language than the language in which that god was originally worshipped. You can worship a god in a different culture, right? Like, all of those things are allowable. But I think that the closer we get to that original context, the easier it is to feel the presence of that deity, and the less you're swimming upstream, the less you're working against the current. So that, if you are speaking Greek and embedded in Greek culture, and you are living at Paphos, you're going to have, connecting with Aphrodite is going to feel right and easy and natural. Whereas if you don't speak Greek and you don't live in Greece and you aren't familiar with a lot of Greek culture or history, you can still reach out to that goddess, you can still form a relationship, but it may take more work. And I don't know. I think about this a lot with regard to the Slavic polytheism that I used to practice. And a lot of why I stopped practicing Slavic polytheism, a lot of why I stopped really engaging with those gods, was that it just felt like too much work. And not too much work in the sense that, like, it was, religiously demanding, because religion can, and in some cases should be, demanding, and that's appropriate. But too much work in the sense that I don't speak the languages that these gods spoke, or the languages that are descended from those languages, right? Like, it's not just that I don't speak Proto-Slavic, but I also don't speak any of the languages that are descendants of Proto-Slavic. I have some nominal, familial and cultural connections, but they're very, very weak. They're very tenuous. I'm not steeped in that culture. I'm not living in that place. And the result is that it felt very difficult for me to access those gods, to understand them, to relate to them. I don't rule out the possibility of coming back to those gods at some point in the future. But I feel that in order for me to do so, I would need to have something stronger that allowed me to connect with them. And I think if I'm trying to identify the things that gods shape themselves around, and the things that allow us to access the mystery of a particular god through that god and not through some other god, the things I come back to are culture, history, language, geography, and then, in the case of Wicca, initiatory lineage. We'll put a pin in that one and come back to it. But, I think that part of the reason that, like, American pagans in particular find it so easy to access and to try to build relationships with Greek deities is that so much of American culture self-consciously models itself around ancient Greek culture. Sometimes in ways that can be a little fetishistic, and maybe we should interrogate that. But there's a sense, right or wrong, there's a sense that people have that these gods are kind of already part of the culture they have access to. There's a reason that, like, American pagans of Irish descent often end up wanting to worship Irish gods. And there can be some weird, complicated, pseudo-white supremacist ethnicity stuff going on. But if we set that aside and try to think about kind of the deeper intent, I think a lot of the time it is either an expression of a feeling of culture that American or Irish Americans have, sort of feeling of pride in, having come from Ireland and wanting to reconnect with that, or a desire to connect with that ancestry and with the culture that goes along with it. And I think the more of those things you have, the easier it is to connect with gods. And there are, meaningful ways in which, like, you go to Ireland and it's a very similar experience to what I had in Venice, where you're like, oh, there are gods who are the gods of this place, and it is only right and proper to worship those gods in this place. And even if I would not otherwise feel drawn to those gods, have a relationship with those gods, if I'm in this place, if I'm in their place, I'm going to venerate them. And I think that's also true along lines other than geographic, right? If you're dealing with cultural and linguistic and historical ties, there are things that kind of bind us to the gods. And those connections are the reason that you might, you might reach out to the Morrigan as a goddess of sovereignty instead of to Isis. The reason that we're able to access one deity or another, the reason we're able to form a relationship with one deity or another, is because of these kinds of ties. And in Wicca in particular, there is the line of initiatory descent. And not only in Wicca, right? Like, I think there are other gods, there are other religions that have lines of initiatory descent that are similar. Sometimes that's, right, like a family descent thing. So there are certain gods that you have access to by virtue of your family lineage. Judaism is a prime example of this, right? Judaism is an ethnic religion. The ethnicity and the religion go hand in hand in an important way, and that's all complicated and difficult to unpack. But in Wicca, I have access to the goddess and the god of Wicca. I have the ability to form a deep, meaningful relationship with them wherever I am in the world, and whatever language I am speaking, and whatever culture I belong to. I have the ability to connect with those gods because of my initiation and because of the lineage behind that initiation. It gives me a right to these gods. It gives me access to these gods. In a way that I am able to carry those gods with me wherever I go. I am their priest. I carry their worship with me no matter where I am. And it will always be appropriate, I think. I'm sure someone in the comments will appear and tell me otherwise. But it feels to me like it will always be appropriate for me to worship those gods because of that line of initiatory descent. So that can be a really powerful thing that binds us to the gods, that allows the gods to kind of come through to us. And absent something like an initiatory lineage, I think we end up falling back on geography, culture, language, history, etc. So, yeah, I don't know. Gods are weird and gods are complicated. And ultimately, I think that what a god is a mystery. But there's so much that mystery kind of shapes itself around, and I think that ends up being, I don't know. There are places that gods just feel like they belong. There are people that gods just feel like they belong with. There are settings where it just feels right to invoke or pray to or petition or venerate certain deities. And I don't really understand what differentiates them, but it feels like there's something there, and it feels very important to try to understand. And at least an element of that, I do think, really comes down to geography. I really, really think that when you go to a place that has historically belonged to a particular deity, there's just this overwhelming feeling of, oh, this is who belongs here. This is who should receive worship here. So I will wrap this up here because I don't think I have much else to say that's going to be coherent or thoughtful. But thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.